Well, good evening and welcome to the Baker Institute. We're very pleased to have you here this evening, and I think it should be a very interesting program. I think of a number of you have probably been following the space program, and we have a partner in Russia that has been a very good partner for us, that came into our program really as one of the partners on the space station, but previously to that we had flown the Apollo-Soyuz back in the 70s. But they have been a very good partner for us in the space station. And had we not had the Russians involved, we wouldn't have been able to maintain the space station after the Columbia shuttle had its tragic accident. And so during that time period, until we reflew the shuttle, our Russian colleagues really helped us to maintain our program and keep our American astronauts and cosmonauts in orbit. And we're very fortunate this evening to have an individual who has had a great deal of experience and been very much involved in the Russian program, Michael Foale. Michael was born in England, and his mother was American and father was English and served in the Royal Air Force. And Michael was raised in England and other places around the world, and then went to school at Cambridge and received a doctorate from Cambridge in astrophysics, and came to Houston in the early 80s and worked for McDonnell Douglas because he was quite interested in becoming an astronaut, and he didn't have that opportunity in Great Britain. He was hired by NASA in 1983, and he had applied to be an astronaut prior to that time and kept applying a number of times, and we finally accepted Michael as an astronaut in 1987. He flew his first shuttle flight in 1992, and then another shuttle flight in 93, and then was a crew member on the first shuttle at rendezvous with the Russian Mir spacecraft in 1995. And in 1997, he flew on board the Mir, and in between 95 and 97, he and his family lived in Star City in Russia, and Michael is quite proficient at Russian, so those of you in the audience that speak Russian, if you want to ask your questions in Russian, he can answer them very well. But he flew on board the Russian Mir spacecraft, and he went up on a shuttle and came back on a shuttle, and was there for when the Progress struck the Mir, and helped stabilize the environment in the vehicle and getting it back under control during that time period. He came back and then flew a very successful mission on the shuttle again to service the Hubble Space Telescope in 1999, and then he has also flown in 2003. Flew as a commander on board the International Space Station, going up on a Soyuz and coming back on a Soyuz. So I think he's quite capable, I think, of telling us all about working with the Russians, because he has certainly been doing that for probably the last decade. So let me introduce Michael Foale, who I think will be able to really give you a good appreciation on our Russian partners and how we have been working with them. Right, Michael?
Thank you, George. Well, hello everybody. Добрый вечер. Это очень приятно видеть здесь русских лиц. I'd like to say I feel a little uncomfortable speaking in front of Russians about an American's perception of working with Russians. And it brings me to mind immediately a very, very dear friend of mine, Sergei Krikalev, who's a cosmonaut, a current cosmonaut, with whom I've spent many, many hours, days, either windsurfing or training or flying. And when he has spoken in Russia about working with Americans, and I've heard what he said, I go, really? And I just hope what I say today isn't quite as shocking to Russians as it might be. Today I'm going to tell you a story, really. I'm not going to offer a treatise on how Russians and Americans work together. I'm not really going to cover foreign policy. I'm not really going to cover the issues and the politics that went into this story that I'm going to tell you. I'm just going to try and give it to you from a personal point of view and see what we get out of that. So if we can bring down the lights, David or someone. Are we going to bring down the lights? Can we do that, Damien, or do that? Takes a second. The story kind of begins in about 1959 or so, when I was this young person in the middle, and my father was on the left here of me, was a Royal Air Force pilot, and he was a fighter pilot. He was flying Meteors in, at that time, Cyprus, and he was flying patrols against the Soviet Union. And I grew up knowing all about the Soviet Union, how terrible the Soviet Union was. And I remember being taught in school about how there was only going to be 4 minutes from the time that there would be an announcement of a missile attack on Great Britain, and how we should all get under the table. I'm sure Soviet children were being taught similar things. About the same time when that picture of me as a young boy was taken, already Sputnik had flown in space, and Yuri Gagarin flew. And it shocked the world. I was unaware of it, being a small boy of about 4. But at this time, there was really no idea of any kind of working together in space at all between Russians and Americans. America was shocked, as you all know, by the events of Sputnik and then Yuri Gagarin's flight, because it meant that these big rockets could carry atomic bombs across the oceans and hit the other continent. This is a picture of Alan Shepard, the first American to go into space. And following that, there was an extraordinarily powerful decision made by John F. Kennedy to send a person to the moon. And this is a picture of Apollo 11, and then I think this is probably actually Buzz Aldrin on the lunar surface. And that happened in 1969. I followed this at the age of about 12 with great interest. I was actually living in Malta at the time. My father was based in the Air Force, Royal Air Force there. And there was still no thought that anything but bad things happened in the Soviet Union. And we certainly, as a British child at that time, didn't ever imagine that I'd have any contact with Russians at all. However, things started to change in the world for the better. And this is the first example of Russian-American détente, I think, that was really concrete and visible to the world. I was working as a labourer in Scotland, getting ready to go to Cambridge when this flight took place. And it was the Apollo-Soyuz test project. And simply the mission was to join up a Soyuz spacecraft, shown here, with an Apollo spacecraft. And it was totally symbolic to the world as a handshake between two people, two spacecraft. However, what it had done already on the ground was the seed, really, of what was to follow, which was hundreds of people traveled from the United States, mostly engineers, to the Soviet Union, and some from the Soviet Union to Texas, to talk about how to bring these spacecraft together. And even today now in Star City in Russia, I still meet people, drivers, for example, Russian drivers, who remember those days, and they remember the Americans. And Tom Stafford, who's shown here in this picture, the commander of the Apollo, who came across. About this time, I was kind of popping up in Cambridge, son of a Royal Air Force officer, mother's from Minnesota. And I was trying to become an astronaut, but I love flying, and I was gliding here in the fog here just to the south of Cambridge at Duxford. Mr. Abbey has already mentioned the numerous failed attempts I made to become an astronaut. It did involve me coming to Houston in Texas to meet George Abbey as a young PhD student still. I'm glad he told me to go back to Cambridge and finish my PhD. And it took, when young children ask me, what does it take, how long does it take to be an astronaut, or how long does it take to train? You know, they expect the answer like 3 or 5 years, maybe less. But I have to say it took me roughly 30 years to become an astronaut, because at the age of 35 on the Space Shuttle Atlantis, I figured that I wanted to be an astronaut when I was 6, and it took me about 29 years to get to this point. But this really had nothing to do with Russia still, and it had nothing to do with the Soviet Union. However, it was 1992, and incredibly dramatic events were taking place in the Soviet Union during Gorbachev's presidency. And I was totally wrapped up in this flight, which was, by the way, to study global warming, the ozone hole, changing the solar constant and the solar brightness on the Atlas payload, but I'm not here today to tell you about that. And I flew as a scientist astronaut on that mission. My first contact with Russia, the first idea that anything was going to happen where I would learn something more about this ex-Soviet Union, now Russia, was when probably Mr. Abbey took the decision to assign me to this flight. And this is an emblem of a flight called STS-63. It was a flight that was significant in that it was originally a space shuttle flight to do typical American things in space, deploy satellites, do some experiments. But really as an afterthought, as part of the brand new programs begun with George Abbey and NASA Administrator Goldin in Russia in 1992, I think it was the same year, where they witnessed tanks rolling over the bridge and shots being fired at the White House in Moscow, at the Duma. The decision was made to make the space station an international space station in partnership with Russia. And so we had added to our flight this gentleman, Vladimir Titov, or Titov is, I have to use American or Russian pronunciation, but we say Vladimir Titov. And he brought his flag to our mission. And we were given the task to fly up to, but not to touch, the Russian space station, Mir. And this was with Commander Jim Weatherby. And we approached the Russian space station above the Earth after doing our primary mission to fly up just to 15 meters away from the Mir space station. And I remember how nervous Jim was as we approached the space station Mir. But we were amazed to see people in the station, which we were able to talk to. It was all rigged at the last minute using just simple VHF radios. We saw this gentleman in the window. But before that, we also saw Yelena Kondakova. This is Polyakov, who had already been in space a year at this time and returned to Earth after being in space a year and about 3 months. We waved. Yelena, who I did not understand, I had learned 1 or 2 words of Russian from Vladimir, from Titov. And he wouldn't really say much on the radio. He was chatting to his crewmates. Of course, he knew these cosmonauts that were on the Mir. But Jim and I were trying to say something, and we didn't know what to say. I couldn't speak any Russian. And it was very frustrating. But I had learned the word for tea, because I'm British, and chai s molokom is tea with milk. And I heard Yelena say, "We wish you could come and have tea, and we will give you tea." And I said, "What, smolokom?" And she said, "Da." And that was it, the end of our communication. Moscow and Houston were extraordinarily excited to see pictures coming down from each vehicle of the other. It was the first time that 2 vehicles had come together but not touched since the Apollo-Soyuz project in 1975. And when we landed, this is Titov here, and Jim Weatherby, myself, and Eileen Collins, who was the pilot on this mission. We knew things were really starting to happen between the United States and Russia in space. The next mission was followed by an agreement to launch an American to the Mir space station on a Russian rocket, the Soyuz. And this involved the American going to Star City. And Star City, I think, is exemplified by the big statue there of Gagarin in front of the Dom Cosmonauta, that cosmonauts building here, which is actually Titov lives in this building. And it was Norm Thagard and Bonnie Dunbar, his backup, who were to launch on a Russian vehicle to the Mir space station. That launch took place while I was basically doing my post-flight appearances here in the States and in Washington, D.C. That launch took place on a Soyuz from Kazakhstan and took Norm to the space station Mir, where he was to stay for 4 months. I'll take this opportunity to point, because it will come up later on. This is what's called the base block of the Mir space station. And this vehicle is a cargo ship that brings up, it weighs about 7 tons and brings up material, spares, food, water, and oxygen to the station. And this module here is the Spectra module, where I was to spend some time. Norm did his mission well, and the whole partnership agreement between the United States and Russia was to not only launch Norm on a Russian rocket to the Mir station, but to bring back Norm on the space shuttle and the cosmonauts that were there with him. And the space shuttle docked for the first time with the Mir space station, and it was the mission STS-71. And here you see Mir kind of extending up to the ceiling. This is a view from the space shuttle's aft windows. And it brought those 2 cosmonauts home, Solovyov and Budarin, together with Norm Thagard. And about that time, I was hoping, I think, to fly on a space shuttle, because that was going to be the easy thing for me to do. It would be my 4th flight. Space shuttles, you train to fly in space for 10 days. It takes about a year to train for them. You don't have to leave home, except for the mission. But I was visiting on a post-flight to Russia here in Star City, when one of the secretaries in the office said to me, "Oh, Michael, you're going to be moving here in 3 weeks, I hear." I go, "I am." And there had been an agreement made that I was to move to Russia with and my family was invited, luckily they came, spend a year and a half learning Russian and getting ready to take part in the Shuttle Mir program, or in Russia we call it Mir Shuttle. And I was to be one of actually a series of astronauts after Norm Thagard to fly to the Mir space station. So here you see us in Star City with our office team. That was all that we had supporting us in Russia, in the snow, which is a typical landmark for Star City when we show it to Americans, with Gagarin behind us. And the gentlemen all in blue suits, including myself here with my young son Ian, who's less than 1 year old, and my daughter Jenna. We're the astronauts training, each of us backing up the other, to be a series of astronauts going to the Mir space station on the space shuttle taking us there. Arriving in Russia at that time in 1995, actually this is probably January because the weather's good, but in 1995 in the fall, I had to start walking through snow and slush to get to the territory. Life was harder then in 1995 than it is now. My wife had never lived abroad, Rhonda. The children were small. I had to get used to going to the training site. This is the centrifuge building. And my daughter, Jenna, had to get used to Детский сад. And here you see them eating their bowls of soup. And I had to start learning some different things too. I had to learn how to exercise the way my Russian trainers wanted me to exercise. And there were a lot of conflicts in our approach to training. Russians had a different way to train cosmonauts. Yuri Gagarin had to eject out of his capsule when he landed. And so ejection and parachuting has always been a part of the cosmonaut culture. American astronauts were pulled out initially from test pilots. So piloting aircraft has always been part of the American culture for astronauts. Part of the Gagarin training was a little bit of karma and yoga and meditation and balance. And I was very surprised that I had to start doing flips on trampolines, supervised, and do exercises like this. The training mock-ups were not so different actually from ours here at the Johnson Space Center, but they consisted of mock-ups of the Mir space station laid out in a big training hall. Something else I had to get used to was Russian space food. It's fortunate that I went to a British boarding school. I like space food. And this food really isn't so different. I thought it was pretty good. This is David Wolf on my right. And he followed me to the Mir space station. And here's David in a Russian launch spacesuit. That's called the Sokol suit, and it's used on the Soyuz spacecraft in the event of a depressurization. Again, with the ubiquitous snow adding to it all. And we had to start, for example, survival training, where the Soyuz spacecraft, because it's in an orbit going to the Mir space station, this is true of the International Space Station too, covers large parts of the world. So if you had to do an emergency deorbit, you could end up in the northern parts of Siberia or in the jungle of middle latitudes and in the equatorial, or in deserts. And so part of the training started off here, actually quite near Star City, with Valery Korzun and John Blaha, another American astronaut in training. And we've been heat-soaked in the capsule and then put out into the snow for 2 days to live off. We have 1,000 calories total of food between the three of us in a survival kit. And all I remember was two things. Very big impression was we were cold already by the time we got there. The sun went down. And I was just following Valery through the woods all night, chopping down trees with a hatchet that was makes the stock of the gun that we carry on the Soyuz for hunting in case wolves attack us. And the whole time we flew, we were together in the forest here. I heard planes taking off going to Chechnya from Chikolovsky Airport every 6 minutes. That was the eve of 1995 through 6. Some other training we did, where I started to get better Russian, was to train at the Black Sea. And here we have finally extracted ourselves from the capsule and bailed out of the Soyuz to putting on our full dry suit. They call it the forel, which means, I think, trout in Russian. It's our forel suits waiting to be picked up. My training also was, of course, as part of a Russian crew in the event that we would have to land on the Earth on a Soyuz as opposed to on a space shuttle. I trained as part of a crew called Mir 24, commanded by Anatoly Solovyov and Pavel Vinogradov, who's just returned from space, actually, from the International Space Station. And Anatoly was a very, very friendly, charming person. He had come back on the space shuttle with Norm Thaggards. He knew Americans already. I didn't know his feelings about the program, although they were negative, basically. And then Pavel, who was kind of a happy-go-lucky, I think it was his first flight to go, and I was training with him as the right-seater. And my role was very well defined. It was pretty close to that of the tourist astronaut that flies today in the Soyuz. Because I was a professional astronaut, I wanted to pay attention, I wanted to understand, and indeed we were given the lectures to understand some of the systems, but in a very limited way. Because again, this was a backup way for me to come back to Earth. However, there's more to it than just a visit as a guest tourist to the space station. We had to train to do a spacewalk involving American experiments that were going to be taken outside. And here I was training as a backup to Jerry Leninger to do a spacewalk outside the Mir station. However, I was not planned to do a spacewalk. As part of all this was going on in Russia, my Russian language really wasn't doing very well, because I was coming home from the territory to my family, and Rhonda wanted to speak English. She had small children. She didn't want to deal with me trying to speak Russian. My daughter was speaking awful Russian, the most rude Russian. It's just how children speak in Детский сад. And it was very unpleasant. And I was always shocked by how she spoke. I thought it was very impolite. I hadn't realized that you're allowed to talk that way. And so I was unhappy with my social Russian skills in Russia. But leaving my family in Russia, I would come to the States to train on the American payloads that we were going to take up with us on the space shuttle to Mir. And it was here in the States, well, my family in Russia, that I got to know Yelena Kondakova, who was the lady who had waved to me from the Mir space station out of the porthole. And she'd come back from her 6-month mission to the space station Mir and had come to the United States to train in the same way that I was training in Russia. She was here training to fly on the space shuttle. And I was part of a crew commanded by Charlie Precourt, Ed Lu, we had Eileen, who was the pilot, Yelena, Carlos Noriega, and Jean-François Clairvoy, who's from France, and a European astronaut. And we are here down at the space shuttle Atlantis before launch, looking it over before we actually get blasted off. And this is a day we spent looking around the pad. And then I remember very much how Yelena had realized that I was nervous about going to the Mir space station. I had read Krutoy Marschrut by Ginsberg. I had some very dismal ideas about what it might be like on the Mir space station. We had had a fire on the Mir space station that my predecessor, who I was to replace, Jerry Leninger, had experienced. He'd written a very professional, but not a very optimistic note about the fire to our NASA management and controllers, and I had seen a copy of that letter. And the Russians that were actually on the Mir space station at that time were not the Russians I'd trained with. They were Vasily Tseblev and Sasha Lazutkin, who I had only met at dinner in the United States when we were here training on payloads in the United States. However, it was there or here in the United States that I actually learned more Russian staying in the Residence Inn in the hotel with the Russians than I did in Russia when I was living with my family. So all of this I probably showed, and Yelena sensed it, and so she would ask me, are you nervous about going? I said, yes. And she said, oh, don't worry, it'll all be okay. But she also was a little nervous about the space shuttle, because she'd heard about, she knew all about the Challenger accident that had preceded this. And so when we both blasted off together, we kind of provided each other mutual support during the flight. And now as we approached the space station Mir, hanging beautifully above the Earth, I really started to think, what have I gotten myself into? There's 4 months ahead here on this space station with 2 Russians who do not speak any English at all. And I wasn't quite sure how it was going to go. I should tell you that my conversations with Yelena were in Russian, so I had progressed to that level, and she allowed me to speak Russian with her all the time, and that was very helpful. So as I saw the Mir approach and the docking adapter come closer and closer, as Charlie Precourt brought us into a docking, I was kind of looking up in the window, and Yelena caught my look. She said, "Ti pechalna?" And I said, no. And she said, are you feeling sad or gloomy? And I said, no, but I was kind of hiding it. But when we got on board, it was like a completely new discovery, because suddenly, as we opened up the hatch and we went through the narrow passageway towards the base block, we heard loud music. It was Russian music, but it was loud. And it was fun, it had a beat to it. You could smell the food cooking. It was lived in, it was fairly chaotic there. But as you can see, Vasily Tseblev had really laid on a great welcome for us. And almost all of my anxiety and nervousness kind of evaporated in those first few moments as I floated through into the Mir space station. And Yelena had brought these silver-coated space shuttle chocolates as a gift for the crew. This is Yelena and Eileen Collins. And here's Jerry Leninger in the Spectra module that I pointed out to you. And Jerry was really, really glad to see us. He'd had a hard time. The fire was a very dangerous and difficult event for the whole crew. And he had slightly long hair and a beard, and I could tell he wanted to speak English, basically. And he told me a lot of things about what had happened on the Mir before I arrived. And And he told me about one event in particular, not just the fire, which I'd already read his report. He said there's this strange, there's this test they've been doing with a, they being Russia, you know, the Russians. There's a test they've been doing with the Progress cargo ship. And I don't know why, he said. I don't know why they're doing this test. And to be honest, no one at NASA knew why this test was being done. It hadn't caught anyone's attention. There's a test they tried to dock the Progress to the back end of the station without using the radar range and speed measurement system. And he said, I don't know why they're doing that. And he was very emphatic. And I had already gone through this emotional oscillation of being nervous and then being happy because it was such a friendly place. So I thought, yes, Jerry, you've been here a long time, you know, it'll be okay. And I really didn't think too much of it, what he told me. And as Atlantis pulled away after 5 days of handover, and Jerry was going home, I really was looking forward to just doing research in the Spectre and Preroda modules, US experiments that had been delivered there on those modules, and also with the space shuttle. And for the first 6 weeks or so, I just did experiments, and I was very happy. The station changed a little bit. It became a bit more untidy. And Sasha here, Lazutkin, became a very close friend, as did Vasily. I started a movie night. I started to show them. I was the only one with a working movie player. I only played NTSC, so I would have them come to the Spectre module, and I'd set up a movie on a TV screen. And on Sundays, when Vasily was still exhausted, they were always working to repair systems on the Mir. The Mir was an old station, 13 years old when I was there, I think. They would relax with me, and I would try and translate the movie to my Russian crewmates in Russian. So I didn't start with Shakespeare, which I had with me, you know, Much Ado About Nothing. I started with Total Recall. Some kind of, and one of the movies, it was Total Recall, where Sasha said, you know, I have a bad feeling about it. And what he'd seen was a depressurization on the surface of Mars. And I thought, oh, don't worry about it, Sasha. Nothing's, you know. Anyway, this experiment that Jerry had told me about was repeated. And I got up in the morning and was scheduled to do experiments, but I was interested in what Vasily and Sasha were doing. And so he was bringing in a Progress supply ship, cargo ship, manually, without any information about the speed or the distance, except from the size of the image on the screen. And he was controlling it using a TV camera mounted on the Progress that you see coming in. And he's meant to dock on this part of the station. But as he gets closer and closer, it turns out he wasn't able to determine the speed at which he was approaching, and so hadn't braked enough of the speed. Because he simply just didn't have the visual cues, the measurement system, to determine what the speed is coming into this axis. So you can see if he's meant to dock on the bottom here, he's in the wrong position. He's actually coming down on top of the Mir here. And he's coming in at about 18 miles an hour. And at this point, they've asked me to try and find where the Progress supply ship is. By the way, this is video I wasn't meant to take. I just happened to put an NTSC camera, that's why the flickering's going on, watching their TV screen. And so Sasha just said, Michael, quickly go to the spacecraft, corral. And the next thing we know is there's a crash and a crunch. I'm passing through into the Soyuz spacecraft. I don't feel any shocks because my hands aren't touching the spacecraft. I'm not touching this Mir. And I float into the Soyuz. And this was the damage that was done. It crunched onto the Spectre module, damaged the solar array, and unfortunately broke part of the hull. And so the Spectre module started to depress. And the air would go out of the station. And we had about 14 minutes to resolve the time available, with the oxygen available, to resolve the problem or leave. And it was Sasha Lazutkin who very successfully, in the end, determined where the leak was. And we pulled the cables out of that hatchway, managed to put a hatch in place in 6 minutes, and basically he saved the space station Mir. After that, we had a very difficult time re-establishing power to the station because we disconnected about a third of the station's power, disconnecting this module and its solar arrays. And the accident had happened, the collision had happened only about 6 minutes after the event. So when the Russian control center came in contact with us, we didn't have continuous contact. They were floored as to what to do, and it was many orbits before we were able to establish the orbit and the orientation of the station, again, so that it could capture enough energy to turn on all of the systems in the mirror. Another month went by while the Russian control center tried to regain control of the mirror. But in the end, and there was a plan for us to do a spacewalk inside that module that we had disconnected and put a hatch into. However, another problem arose, caused by the crew actually. It was Sasha who disconnected a cable late at night, very tired. And it put us again into an uncontrolled attitude. At which point they decided that Vasily and Sasha were going to come home. I was going to stay. And this crew, Anatoly Solovyov and Pavel Vinogradov, the ones with whom I trained, were to come up and take their place. And I remember seeing their Soyuz coming in and thinking, wow, the cavalry are coming here. Because Anatoly was a very serious person, Pavel too. And when they arrived, I knew a whole new regime had come in. And Anatoly was the most experienced cosmonaut they had. And as we chatted in the first few days, he told me that I was to do a spacewalk with him to look at the damage done by the collision. So here we are outside, and I'm simply following. I was being asked periodically by the Russian control center that were very, again, nervous about an American in their spacesuit. They weren't sure how I was going to react. So they keep asking me, Michael, что ты делаешь? I go, I'm just following the orders of my commander. And they seem to like that answer. That was Vladimir Solovyov who would ask that question backstage. I should say, the only reason I think I was allowed in this spacesuit to go out to do this EVA was because I had, before the collision, for one reason or another, taken over the communications with SOUP, with the Russian control center. And I did that because I saw that they were spending an hour every night printing out messages. And I am a programmer, and I wrote a program that printed all these messages out. But they're Russian messages, and we didn't have the right fonts on the American computers to do the Russian messages. So I kind of wrote the program, put it all on the Russian machine, and I saved that crew, the previous crew, about an hour every night printing out all their messages. Well, I became, if you know the movie MASH, some of you Americans certainly do, I became the character Radar on the space station. I was the one who always knew what the messages were. And so the Russian control center had been very comfortable with me receiving messages and translating them, giving them to the crew. And I learned my Russian that way. So I feel that was the biggest contribution to them accepting me as part of the crew. About 2 months later after the collision, Space Shuttle Endeavour, I think it was, came up with Jim Weatherby again, a previous commander of mine, and brought also a previous crewmate of mine, Titov, who brought over a special equipment and spares to the Mir station. This is actually in the Space Hab module of the shuttle cargo bay. And we then left that gentleman I showed you in the spacesuit in the snow, David Wolf, with Pavel and Anatoly. I don't know what they said to David as they closed the hatch, but when Vasily and Sasha had closed the hatch on Atlantis and I was left with them, Vasily turned to me and said, Michael, сейчас мы будем бить тебя. And he said, Michael, we're going to beat you now. And I told David that, and I think I set him up for a fairly nervous, hatch closing. As I left the Mir, I wasn't sure if I was ever going to see it again. In fact, I never did. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go back there, but I had the most extraordinary time learning Russian and having an adventure with the crewmates that had already left back back for Earth. I came back, started to work on the Hubble Space Telescope. I was invited to the White House with my family. And as astronauts really don't make foreign policy, and they probably shouldn't. But I asked President Clinton, well, actually, I said, Mr. President, I believe the reason I was on the Mir space station was to be part of a program that was to engage Russia and prevent the complete diaspora of Russian scientists beyond Russia's borders, in particular to Iran. And he said yes. And he actually expounded a little bit on that. Well, I ended up back in Star City, but this time working for Mr. Abbey, not as an astronaut, but as an ineffective diplomat. And I was sent to do something which I really don't think I don't feel good about at all. I was sent to stop Dennis Tito, the first space tourist, from flying. And I had to go to Star City and try and persuade him not to fly in April, but at least delay it till October, before we sent the first US astronaut to the International Space Station. My mission was a failure, so because he flew in April, he told me he couldn't trust anybody in the United States government to not somehow have an effect on Russia to prevent him from flying, and so he was going to take that opportunity there in April. The US side was really worried that it would, I think, just simply distract Russia in launching Expedition 1 to the International Space Station. But here he is. He made history by being the first one to buy a ticket on the Russian Soyuz on board the International Station. This is Bill Shepard, the first commander of the first crew to the International Space Station. Sergei Krikalev and Yuri Gudzenko. This is how it looked when they docked with it. Sergei Krikalev here and Bill, obviously enjoying their food. And then, as the program went on, I flew to the Hubble Space Telescope. It came back. It was in I guess it was 2003. We had Columbia, and I was now training to be on the International Space Station in charge of the Expedition 8 as the commander. And I realized, I was in Russia when I saw those images on TV of Columbia streaking across the Texas skies, that again, I was going to have an abrupt change in our plans, and I was going to fly to the International Space Station on a Soyuz spacecraft, not on a space shuttle, because we didn't have a space shuttle at that time. And now Russia was suddenly becoming a partner that was essential to the US's survival in space. Because without Russia, and without the ability to launch a Soyuz rocket to the International Space Station, we would have had to unman the station or only have Russians on it. As part of that transition to a Soyuz rocket, I was sent out to go and meet the returning crew from the space station, Expedition 6, at its nominal landing site. It turned out it didn't land at the nominal landing site. It landed about 400 kilometers short, with Station Commander Ken Bowersox. And this is the very shaky picture I took of him 400 kilometers away, 8 hours on a helicopter, picking him up after he did a ballistic entry in that Soyuz. So that was another event where the Russian and American teams actually kind of understood each other's problems and recovered well. This put me then with a patch with just one other person, Kaleri, on the International Space Station, launching on a Soyuz. The Soyuz was being paid for by Pedro Duque, a Spanish astronaut. And this is Sasha. We're all in gas masks because we're practicing abandoning the station in a fire and then moving to the Soyuz. I went through my training. We had a brief commission. That's something we don't do in the States. We don't have formal commissions. Probably we should, but we stand up and they tell the world about how you performed in your training and what your good marks were and what your bad marks are. In general, they always are very, very kind to the crews in the final commission. And once they've approved you ready for flight, they send you out to the launch pad on the Soyuz. Okay, David, are we ready? We're going to roll a DVD here. And It's going to tell the story basically of this last flight to the International Space Station, launching on a Soyuz. Here we go. Yep, we got it. The Soyuz is more of a traditional rocket than the space shuttle. It consists of 3 stages. It's rolled out 3 days before launch on railroad tracks to the launch pad at dawn in Kazakhstan at Baikonur. It's erected in a matter of hours to the vertical position and then clamped with a launch tower. We as a crew put on our suits about 5 hours before launch, stand in our little designated squares and receive the salute, and then go to the bus, waving goodbye to our family and to friends and the trainers who trained us. We go out to the launch pad. We stop on the way out by the rails and then climb up the gantry, go up this tiny elevator up to the top. We squeeze into the descent into the Spustkami apparat, which is the capsule. They don't have a countdown in Russia. They just say ignition. Ojiganya, and then off it goes. And it kind of floats off the launch pad. It's not like a shuttle where it pushes you in the back with solid rocket boosters. Here we have a kind of a float off the launch pad, but from that point onwards it gets very dynamic. We feel like there's 3 people sitting on your chest. You're going through 3 Gs. It takes about 8 minutes to get to space, and when you're finally thrown forward into weightlessness, I clasped hands, celebrating us cheating death one more time. Oops, it stopped. Can we hit play on that? There we go. And we put the Soyuz into a gentle spin with the solar rays pointed towards the sun to gather energy. This was actually a video. They don't, again, because I as an American was flying on the Soyuz, really paid for by the Spanish, and we didn't have an arrangement with Russia to pay for American astronauts to fly on the Soyuz because of the Iran Non-Proliferation Act. I really had no rights whatsoever in terms of carrying data products or cameras. So this video was actually smuggled on board by Pedro. We were not allowed to take video on the Soyuz. But because I had a job of measuring the range to the space station, this is a video I shot with a laser rangefinder the Russians wanted to test for future vehicles. I actually was able to take this video as I came in towards the International Space Station. Here you see us coming in towards the station. That's the view we have of the station. We're going to this docking port here. Here's our little docking probe. It's the thing that's going to capture the station. Looks like a bit like a mosquito coming in. We're in this part of the Soyuz spacecraft, and this is the living part. Right now there's a hatch closed between us and the docking port. And then the 3 little hooks capture, and then we're pulled in and we make a solid mate. We replaced the crew. It was Yuri Malenchenko and Ed Lu. We said goodbye to them after a 5-day handover. So Sasha's saying, you know, look in the hatch, wave your hands. And so their spacecraft is now docked and is going to go home. It's been in space for six months, and it will take them back to Earth. And only 4 hours later, they're back on Earth after being there for 6 months. At this point, I turned to Sasha and I said, "Well, how do you feel?" And he says, "Well, how do you feel about being alone with him for the next 6 months?" So we see them say goodbye to them. And we start quite a long program of experiments, space station maintenance. We each do our own experiments. There's very few joint Russian and American experiments, even today. There should be, probably. We launched in October. This is now New Year's Eve. I told Sasha we needed some company in space. He thought I was crazy when I was doing this to the spacesuits, but he got the idea. We had our little yolka right here on the table, our Christmas tree, and enjoyed our tea. This is on New Year's Day. New Year's Eve, I mean. Our Christmas presents and New Year's Eve present hadn't arrived before New Year's Eve, so we had to bring them aboard using the same technique that actually I'd experienced during the Mir flight. But here I was already I was trained to do this operation, guiding the cargo ship into the space station. Sasha was responsible for it and was the commander for it. We did not need to use it, it came in automatically just fine. But here Sasha's practicing that very action that I had experienced the collision from. So here you see the progress coming up, and Sasha understood I was a little, more anxious about this event than most other things that happened on the Russian side. And he understood because he knew I'd been on the Mir. And the progress is coming around the back towards the service module of the space station to join up with us. It brought spacesuits, new spacesuits that Sasha and I were to use to take out experiments to the Russian part of the station, the service module. These suits are very different from American suits in that they have a higher pressure, about 50% more pressure, they're stiffer. But you can get into them much quicker, you can do your EVA much more easily than with the US suit, which requires a lot of reconfiguration of the airlock before you do it. Here we are in our tube suit, keep us cool. We jump into the main airlock of the space station. The Russian airlock is called Pierce. It's a whole module in its own right. We go through the hatchway once we've got the rest of the space station ready to be abandoned, because there's no one else on the space station. We're going into this airlock, we're going to close the hatch behind us. And it may be that if we can't get back into the station, we'll have to come home by using these spacesuits to get into the Soyuz spacecraft. So here we open up the back door of the suits and jump into them. We're very encumbered and stiff in the spacesuit. There's about 6 pounds per square inch pressure, or 0.4 atmospheres, kilopascal. And then this is the view coming out of the airlock towards the service module along a truss. We put our hooks that keep us attached to the space station along rails like these. And then this is a view looking back from the airlock towards the American end and the Canadian arm that was watching us. And this is a view from the Canadian arm as we're outside performing our tasks, installing this array of European and Russian experiments on the outside. Unfortunately, we had to cut this spacewalk short. This is a sunrise in space. Let's just see how quickly the light goes out.
Eclipse. Got it.
You heard the voice of a Russian translator. And then 6 months goes by, and the first people that we're to see in 6 months arrive in a Soyuz spacecraft, bringing this time Michael Fink and Gennady Padalka and Andrei Koipas to replace us. And we're going to go home with Andrei. But before that, we have to welcome them and hand over the space station to them. Explain all the little tricks and nuances. I had remembered that Russian women come at a village to welcome you with bread and salt. And I asked Sasha if we could get the little bread loaves that we had and get the salt tablets and put them on a tray. We didn't have any Russian girls to do this for us, so we had to do it ourselves.
Good to see you. Good to see you.
Sasha's giving all kinds of instructions to the rather clumsy newcomers, so they don't knock things off the walls, or that we haven't told them about yet. They've been in the Soyuz spacecraft for 2 days, so they're very happy to get to a modern working toilet and cooked food. This is Gennady. So here's the bread and salt trick. And unfortunately, Mike didn't fully understand that I was doing something symbolically here, because he started to eat the salt tablets. I was worried he was going to get sick. And then we spent the next 4 or 5 days. I was very, very happy to see them. Sasha was too, showing them how to use the space station arm built by Canada. Here it is over This is Newfoundland, and we're going towards Russia. We operate the arm from inside the US part of the space station, the laboratory module. And both Michael and Gennady are trained to operate it. A big difference from
Gennady, please accept command of the International Space Station as we begin our final days of preparation to return home.
This is an American tradition, not a Russian one.
Okay.
Started by Bill Shepard, the US Navy. But Gennady took part just fine. Very soon after this,
from a camera
we were
inside
going home, and we
the
had
space station, that handheld camera by the Expedition 9 crew, looking out a window, looking directly at the Soyuz spacecraft as it begins.
It's only 4 hours to the surface. It's a very rough ride. You see fire out the windows. The windows melt, they blacken, then they come off again, and there's another pair of windows underneath. You feel a big jolt when you hit the ground, and then you hear people tapping on the window. And a few minutes later, you're smelling the fresh smell of Kazakhstan and the dirt. You're put to rest in these dog fur-covered deck chairs and enjoying the smell of people all around you. And about 4 hours later, we're back in Star City, seeing our families, and being taken off to the first bath in 6 months. That was the hole left by the retro rocket of the Progress. We have a big ceremony in Star City where everybody welcomes us in a band, and then after 3 weeks, we're brought back to the United States to debrief all of our colleagues and friends here in Houston. That's the end of the video presentation. In fact, that's the end of the story so far.
Well, thank you, Michael. I think Michael will answer some questions if we have some questions from the audience. Yeah.
Could you talk about the EVA that's going to take place with the Hubble?
Oh, yes, you have heard in the news that Hubble's going to be serviced one last time. I think there's up to 5 EVAs planned for that mission. One of the most interesting things that's being discussed is to put a docking system on the bottom of the Hubble, so it can be docked with again, either by, well, a CEV as we call it. They will be replacing primarily the attitude gyros that are in the Hubble. There's 6 of them. There'll be other modifications made, and a new instrument will be replaced. I'm not on that mission, so I can't really tell you much more about it.
When you were discussing the collision on the mirror, you mentioned that at the time you had no idea why this maneuver had been requested. Did you ever subsequently find out why someone wanted to do this?
Yes, I did, and these are all the points that are extraordinarily interesting, and you could write treatises about it. Basically, as I understand it, the guidance system, the radar is basically the simplest way to describe it, but it's a transponder system called Kurs, used to be built in the Ukraine. And the price, Ukraine was having its own problems with its economy. Its aerospace factories are having trouble keeping its employees. And so they put the price up to the Energia Corporation that was buying that box to put on the Soyuz spacecraft. That price became so high and so untenable for Energia that they wanted to just do away with the box entirely. And they were charging millions for it, being charged millions for it. So someone had the idea at Energia to attempt to train the cosmonaut crews to do the whole approach manually. The idea was thought up, I think, rather quickly, only a few months before my flight. The crew, my crew, Vasily Tsiblev and Lazutkin, had only been trained on it in the last 2 weeks down at Baikonur before launch. And the whole analysis of trajectory monitoring, rate determination, all of the technical things that you need to do to make that space vehicle slow down and dock successfully, that analysis just had not been done effectively and thoroughly enough. So the collision resulted because it was beyond the control of the crew. That's my opinion. Sasha Kaleri, with whom I flew, has a harder opinion about it. Other cosmonauts say, well, yeah, we could have done it. But I don't actually believe that. I think that's a little hubris. The speed with which the Progress and the Soyuz come into a docking is extraordinary. They basically change speed by about 80 meters per second to brake and to come into the station in a very rapid time, in less than an hour. That is such a fast maneuver that you need these radio systems to measure the speeds to do it successfully. And we discovered with the collision, with that failed attempt of docking, that it's not really doable by a crew. And that it's not been attempted ever since. What the United States learned from all that was we had better pay attention to what our partner is doing. And Russia should do the same thing when the US is doing something on its own side that has significant integrated operational impacts on the station. And so after that, Frank Culbertson, who was the Mir program manager in the United States, there was a commission established to investigate the accident. He became very much involved with his Russian counterpart, Valery Ryumin, to track down who was to blame, who was guilty, what should be done so this doesn't occur. And in general, I think out of that collision, which was a very bad day for Russia in particular, because it lost that module just about permanently. We got the power back by putting in a power plug during a second EVA, but we never got the module back. I lost my private things in there because that's where I used to sleep. Nonetheless, on the ground, because suddenly we had to talk very seriously, the two countries together about this, and there were discussions in the Congress, and Frank Culbertson, the program manager, had to go to Congress to discuss whether or not we should continue the Shuttle Mir program. Out of that, we gained a much stronger team, I think, between the Russian and the US flight controllers and program managers. And it was actually provided the basis by which we built up the trust for the International Space Station. So it was a kind of a sad beginning, but it ended up on a good note, I think.
Any other questions? Yeah.
How do you deal with the debris in space? Is there a problem there?
Yes, there is debris in space, and we don't deal with it as well as we could. There's two types of debris. There's the large space rocket that's been discarded, and that will vaporize the station if it collides with us. And there were 2 times on Mir where it was Anatoly said, actually, the US side called up and said, there's going to be a conjunction, that's the euphemism for a near miss, with an Ariane second stage, which is huge. It would just, and they wanted us to go stop exercising and go to the Soyuz. And I sort of laughed, and he said, "Why are you laughing?" I said, "Well, Anatoly, it's going to be this thing traveling at 7 miles a second over there, 1 second, and it's going to be 7 miles away the next second over here. And so in that time, we couldn't do anything in the Soyuz to get away from that collision. So we can't avoid the big objects. However, the small objects, we can put up shielding around the station that will absorb the impact as it passes through the first shield and doesn't penetrate the hull. And there are holes in the solar arrays, and you can see them fist-sized. And we have now one on the space station that's apparently fist-sized in one of the arrays.
But how do you deal with it? Is somebody tracking the trajectories of these debris? Somebody's keeping an account of where the debris are and how to remove them from it?
To a limit, to a size limit. So you can track big objects, like spacecraft. You can track objects that are lost from the space station, like tools. But things that are smaller, those you can't track. If they came off the space station and they're small, they really aren't going to be very harmful because they can't pick up the speed to impact you. It's the ones that come from a different orbit or from outside of the Earth's orbit, like meteorites. Those are the ones that will do us damage. And I remember looking out the window at the Perseid meteorite shower. And I was in the airlock, windows there, it was all quiet, and I saw this meteorite shooting into the atmosphere. And I thought, that's very pretty. But then, next minute, right as I was looking at the window, I hear ding, and there's a little crazed mark in the window. So those things, there is a chance of an impact. If they're small, they are generally dealt with. If they're big, we have to avoid them. It's the ones in the in-between range, I think, where we have the most risk from. Yes?
Have you been scheduled for another mission?
No. Like to be. I've flown in space 6 times, I should add, so I haven't been jilted.
I think Michael has flown 374 days in space.
Oh, somebody's counting. Well, I try not to even. They ask me how many times I've flown in space around the astronaut office. I say, oh, I don't know. Was it 4 or 3 times? So that they don't think I'm taking too many flights.
There's this history of working with Russian cosmonauts. Has there been any dialogue with bringing other countries with emerging space programs to have the kind of same relationship that we have with Russia?
Well, yes. I mean, certainly at you saw the Canadian arm there. Europe has a module that's been delayed and will be part of the International Space Station. It's called Columbus. Japan has a module that's also been delayed. They should go up at the end of next year. Also, Europe's already had a module flying in the space shuttle called Space Lab. And that was a very successful research program. To go beyond that, I would like to see bigger partnerships. So China's an obvious case where it's an emerging, it's already emerged as a space nation, spacefaring nation. And they would add a lot of resilience and reliability to any international space program.
Also, in your talk, you mentioned that when you spoke to President Clinton, that one of the main reasons for you going to Russia was just to build links, and also you mentioned to prevent a brain drain from Russia.
It wasn't a brain drain, it was more like a limitation of rocketry and scientific knowledge to...
You've used Iran in particular.
Yeah, and he mentioned Iran specifically to me.
So is that still perceived as being an issue? And what has the impact been on the Russian economy as a result?
I don't think it's an issue anymore. No. The Russian economies, the Russian scientists have great pride in their nation. I think it was kind of a, I don't have the basis for saying this in terms of fact, but the Russians I know are so proud of being Russian and being scientists that they don't want to leave Russia and to export all that stuff. In fact, they're very, very protective about their technology and their ingenuity, and they have every right to be. Just as the United States has arrangements to prevent our technology going overseas, Russia's just as serious about not exporting its sensitive technology. So there might have been a period in the 92, 93 when there was so many things were changing in Russia, but now, today, I don't think there's any issue there. That's my personal opinion.
Well, it looks like we've exhausted the questions. Michael, you must have done so well on the briefing, they don't have any. So thank you very much, Michael. It was a very good presentation, and I appreciate your coming up here tonight.
Thank you.
And I think we're going to have another briefing. If you enjoyed hearing about the Russians, we have Nikolai Sebastianov, who's the president and general designer of Energia, is going to be speaking here at the Baker Institute on the 5th of December and talk about future Russian activities in space and what they have planned, what they would like to do. So we would invite you to please come back to that as well. It'll be on the 5th of December about the same time.
I should jump in there, George. Don't punish Nikolai Nikolaevich with questions about why did you let the Mir collision take place, because he was not there at the time. He formed his Yamal Corporation.
Yes, he came in well after that.
Well after that, yes. However, he did work on the Mir program in the early days on the paradigms.
I want to talk to Michael for a few minutes afterwards. We have a reception that I hope we'll all stay for a while. Thank you.
I look forward to meeting you. Thank you.
Thank you.